All these mountain climbers decide to scale the second tallest mountain in the world. But up there, they encounter strange, deadly forces that don't let anyone survive. The story begins with a view of the mountain, considered the second highest peak after Mount Everest. Located on the border of China, the temperature here drops extremely low. Despite the harsh environment, several climbers are shown risking their lives to ascend the peak. Locals believe this mountain is heavily cursed. To uncover the truth, a man named Roy continues forward with his 2 children, supported by 2 other companions. Roy's son is Pete, and his daughter is Annie. They hope to climb the K2 mountain range and set their own world record. But the rocks are almost vertical, making the climb nearly impossible for ordinary people. As they motivate one another and slowly push forward, the rope they had secured starts to fray. The 2 people climbing ahead slip and begin to fall. In mountain climbing, everyone is tied to the same rope for momentum, but the increasing weight causes the entire team to hang dangerously. They no longer know how to save themselves, the steep cliff gives them no support. Eventually, the 2 climbers above fall to their deaths, and now Annie is left hanging at the top. Roy realizes that if they stay like this any longer, the rope will snap, killing all 3 of them. So he tells his son Pete to take out a knife and cut the rope. If Roy falls, the weight on the rope will lessen, and Pete and Annie will survive. Annie refuses, but Roy doesn't back down. He keeps urging Pete until, terrified, Pete pulls out the knife and cuts the rope. Roy falls to his death. This tragic moment haunts Annie and Pete for the rest of their lives. As time passes, Pete gives up mountain climbing and becomes a photographer working for different channels. He decides never to return to mountaineering again, as his father's death became a lifelong nightmare for him. But then Pete receives information that the channel he's about to film for is sending a new team of climbers back to the tallest peak in the K2 mountain range. The real problem is that his sister Annie is part of that team. Annie still hasn't given up mountain climbing. In fact, she's determined to climb an even higher peak this time. Worried about her, Pete goes to talk to her and begs her not to go because it's extremely risky. But Annie refuses to listen, especially to her brother, because she still blames Pete for their father Roy's death. If Pete hadn't cut the rope, their father would still be alive. But it was the only choice in that moment, or all 3 of them would have died. After a long argument, it's clear Pete has lost. Annie is going to climb K2 with her team no matter what. At the same camp where the climbers are preparing, a businessman named Ben is introduced. He funded the entire expedition to promote his business. Ben plans to climb to the very top with the expert climbers so he can attract public attention and boost his company's image. He arranged everything carefully, bringing in many specialists to ensure almost zero risk. Ben himself will climb with the professional mountaineers. To celebrate, he hosts a big party that night, where everyone gathers around a bonfire and enjoys themselves. Suddenly, a bearded man named Mike appears. He seems extremely concerned and approaches Ben, warning him about the dangerous risks and massive blizzards they will face on K2. But Ben confidently replies that his team is perfectly prepared and has already analyzed everything. According to their experts, the weather at the summit will remain completely clear. He insisted nothing would go wrong and they would reach the summit without any trouble. But Mike didn't trust any of this and kept warning them not to climb. Ben, however, had already invested a lot of money into this expedition and couldn't back out now, so he ignored Mike's concerns. Disappointed, Mike walked away. He had only tried to help. The next morning, the team of climbers prepared to head toward K2. Snow stretched across the entire region, and the temperature was extremely low. The research team continued sharing updates as they analyzed the conditions, and soon it was time to begin the climb. Before sunrise, Mike is shown shaving in his tent before grabbing his climbing gear and heading up the mountain. No one knows what he's planning, but he clearly senses something dangerous approaching. The climbers begin their ascent, but within a few hours the analysis team detects a massive storm approaching. They notice strong icy winds coming from the north side of K2, and the storm's intensity is extremely high. The team is immediately warned not to climb any further. When Ben hears about the danger, he still dismisses it. He is determined to reach the top no matter what and promote his business. Ignoring all warnings, he pushes the team upward. When Pete learns about the storm and sees how severe it is, he's shocked that Ben and the climbers are still heading up. Pete rushes toward them in a rescue helicopter to help. He can't understand what has possessed Ben and the team to risk their lives like this. K2 has always been notorious for not letting anyone reach its peak. Pete is even more terrified because his sister Annie is among the climbers, and he has already lost his father to a similar situation. This time, he refuses to lose his sister. Pete and others begin tracking Annie to make sure she's safe. Meanwhile, high on the mountain, the team continues climbing. Even after multiple warnings, Ben refuses to stop. He knows a storm is coming, but convinces his team that the chances are very low. Even if the storm arrived, Ben claimed its intensity would be low. Because of this false reassurance, no one realized the real danger, and they kept climbing upward. After hours of climbing, the storm slowly approached. Strong icy winds blew from every direction, and snowfall began. Annie and another climber named Tom started to sense that the storm was getting more intense. Ben's face also showed panic. His predictions were completely wrong, and they were now too high to climb straight back down. The situation became worse when Annie stepped onto a patch of snow that suddenly cracked beneath her feet. It was a narrow ledge, and the collapsing snow caused her to slip down. If she fell directly into the crevice, she would be dead. Thankfully, all the climbers were tied together with ropes. When Annie fell, the others were pulled down with her, but the rope stopped them before hitting the surface. However, the rope snapped, and Annie fell the rest of the way. Luckily, she wasn't seriously injured, and Ben and Tom were also dragged down into the same pit. Soon, the truth became clear: the storm was just a warning sign. A massive avalanche was coming from the peak. Tons of snow cascaded downward at high speed. Everyone was in shock and clueless about what to do. In a situation like this, where an avalanche suddenly breaks loose while mountain climbing, survival becomes extremely difficult. Avalanches form when thick layers of snow at the top of the mountain crack and collapse. Loud sounds or vibrations can also cause the snow to break loose. The first survival rule is not to panic. If the avalanche is small, you must run away from it as fast as possible, but never downhill, because the avalanche will gain speed and overtake you. Instead, move diagonally to escape its path. If you get caught inside, grab onto something like a tree or rock to anchor yourself. If nothing is available, cover your nose and mouth, stay on top of the snow, and try to slide with it until the speed slows. Avalanches eventually slow down when they reach flat ground. But in this story, the avalanche was massive, nobody had time to escape, and most of the climbers died instantly. The only good news was that Annie, Ben, and Tom survived inside the pit. The falling snow packed the entire surface above them tightly. They were trapped so deeply that even their climbing gear couldn't help them escape. All they could do was survive inside that pit and try to contact the rescue team. But the signal was extremely weak. When Pete and the rescue teams at the base learned what had happened, they were completely shocked. Pete panicked, unsure whether his sister was even alive. Since their calls weren't connecting, Annie sent a message in binary code, a language Pete knew perfectly. After decoding it, Pete realized Annie was alive, and Ben and Tom were with her. But the harsh reality was that they wouldn't survive more than a day. They were at a high altitude with almost no resources. Still, Pete refused to give up. He was determined to save his sister no matter what. Sitting with his team, he tried to convince them to send a group of climbers up the mountain for a rescue mission, but everyone was terrified because the deadly storm was still active. Nobody wanted to volunteer, until Pete's friend suggested offering a large reward to whoever joined. That convinced a few people, and Pete quickly selected the best climbers to form a rescue team. They also took help from the military, who provided special explosives capable of breaking through the upper layers of packed snow. These would help reach Annie and the others. With everything ready, the rescue mission began. Pete also wanted to bring along Mike, the bearded man who had warned everyone earlier not to climb. But Mike had disappeared that same day. He had gone toward the mountain and hadn't been seen since. So Pete and his team boarded a helicopter and headed out to save Annie. Their first stop was to search for Mike, because Pete knew Mike was the only person who truly understood the mountain range. He knew every corner of this place like the back of his hand. Mike was packing his gear when Pete rushed in and begged for help, explaining that several climbers, including his own sister, were trapped high on the mountain and would freeze to death within hours if no one reached them. Mike initially refused, reminding Pete that he had warned those climbers not to go up and they had mocked his decision, so he felt no responsibility. But when Pete mentioned that the company was offering a huge reward for rescuing them, Mike finally agreed to join the mission. Meanwhile, conditions for Annie and the others trapped on the lower ridge were getting worse by the minute. The temperature had plunged, their food and water were gone, and Tom, who had suffered severe internal injuries during the avalanche, was barely holding on while Annie tried her best to care for him. Ben, the selfish businessman among them, only focused on saving himself. The group had one last survival option, an emergency drug that could keep a person alive in extreme cold for a few hours, but Tom's dose had been lost in the fall, leaving only 2 doses left. Ben immediately told Annie they would each keep their own dose, making it clear that everyone else was on their own. Using the drug on Tom seemed pointless. He was barely hanging on, suffering from internal bleeding that couldn't be treated in this brutal environment. But Annie still had humanity left in her. She couldn't just watch Tom die like this. Ben, however, was completely selfish and refused to share anything. Ignoring his objections, Annie pulled out her only dose and injected it into Tom, instantly putting her own life in danger because Ben would never give her his. All they could do now was wait and hope the rescue team reached them before it was too late. Meanwhile, Pete's team, guided by Mike, who knew every inch of the mountain, began climbing upward after being dropped near the summit by helicopter. To work faster, Mike split everyone into 2 search teams and warned them that even a small mistake could trigger another deadly avalanche. Mike and Pete climbed together, and during the ascent, Mike revealed that he had known Pete's father and had even worked with him. He reassured Pete that the tragic incident years ago, when Pete cut the rope to save himself and his sister, wasn't his fault. It was the only choice anyone would have made in that situation. Hearing this eased Pete's long-held guilt, a burden he had carried ever since his father's death. That moment had made him quit climbing entirely, and now, after so many years, he was only back on this mountain for one reason: to save his sister's life, not to break any record. Mike and Pete finally made radio contact with Ben and Annie, telling them that help was on the way and that they needed to remember every survival tip they could and stay alive. At this point, we also learned that Mike deeply hated the businessman Ben, and the reason would soon become clear. Inside the cave, Tom's condition was getting worse, which is why Annie had already given him her medicine. But now Annie herself was starting to weaken. She was shivering non-stop from the cold. Tom told her to take some medicine too, but Ben immediately started yelling at her, accusing her of wasting their supply by using it on someone who was practically dying. Annie and Ben argued, and in anger she told him that if he wanted the medicine so badly, he could go and get it from Tom's bag, the one that had fallen somewhere far away when they were dragged down. After some searching, they spotted the bag hanging dangerously over a patch of ice. Annie told Ben to go get it, but Ben was a coward. He always talked big but never did anything, and he knew going out there could cost him his life. So he refused and backed away silently. Annie knew they desperately needed that medicine to survive, so she decided she would risk her own life and climb out to get it. One small mistake could trigger an avalanche and bury the entire cave, but Annie had the courage to try. She jumped carefully, reached the bag, and managed to pull it down safely. Inside were 4 tubes of the survival drug, enough to keep them alive for a few more hours. She planned to save them until the moment they were absolutely needed. For now, all they could do was wait and hope the rescue team arrived in time. Meanwhile, we saw 2 members of Pete's rescue team climbing the mountain ridge when suddenly one climber's foot slipped, and he began to fall. Thankfully, he had his ice axe to hold on. One fell to his death while the female climber survived by hanging onto her axe. Their military-issued explosives fell and detonated below, triggering vibrations that soon grew into a massive avalanche. The male member died, but the female survived because she was hanging to the side. Military forces urgently radioed them, warning that the bombs were extremely heat-sensitive. Direct sunlight could make them explode. Pete and the others hurried into the shade and buried their bags under snow to cool the explosives. But by the time Pete tried warning the rest of the team, it was too late. One of the bombs had already exploded under the sun, causing a massive blast that tore a huge chunk of ancient ice from the mountain. When Mike and Pete reached the area to help their team, there was no one left alive. As the weight of that realization settled in, something suddenly froze Mike in place. Deep inside the thick wall of ice, he saw the faint outline of a woman's body. He stepped closer, squinting through the frost, and the moment he recognized her face, his entire world shattered. It was his wife, the woman he had lost years ago during a mountain climbing expedition. They had been climbing together when a massive avalanche roared down the slope, sweeping her away and burying her somewhere in the vast wilderness. Although rescue teams had searched for days, her body was never found. Ever since then, Mike had returned to the mountain year after year, driven by grief and guilt, pushing himself through brutal conditions in the desperate hope of finding her frozen remains. Now, after all these years, she was finally right in front of him, trapped in a pristine block of ice, her expression calm and untouched by time. Mike gently placed his hand on the icy surface, then slipped the ring off her stiff fingers, a symbol of the life they once shared. As he tried to steady himself emotionally, he noticed something unusual nearby and began searching the surrounding ice more urgently. A moment later, Pete walked up holding a small, weather-worn box. It contained the same survival medicine climbers injected into their bodies to keep their core temperature stable in extreme cold. But when Mike opened the box, he saw that all the vials were empty. Confusion washed over him. If the medicine had been used, then why hadn't his wife survived? At that point, Mike finally revealed something he had kept hidden for years, a truth about that old expedition. He explained that on the day of the accident, he and his wife weren't alone on the mountain. Ben and several other climbers had been with them, and what happened that day was far more complicated than anyone had ever known. After the avalanche, Ben had been trapped in the same pocket of snow and ice as Mike's wife. While Ben somehow clawed his way out and survived, she wasn't so fortunate. But Mike had always known the truth about Ben. He was an unbelievably selfish man, someone who valued his own life far above anyone else's. The more Mike thought about it, the clearer the horrifying possibility became. Ben must have taken not only his own survival injection but also used the emergency medicine meant for Mike's wife, injecting both doses into himself to keep his body warm long enough to escape. The idea that Ben had saved himself by stealing her last chance at survival tore through Mike like a blade. Consumed by rage and grief, Mike made a cold, unwavering decision: he would hunt Ben down and end his life. For him, this was no longer about survival, it was justice, revenge, and closure all twisted together. Pete desperately tried to calm Mike, pleading with him to think rationally, but at this point nothing could reach Mike. His mind was locked in on one mission: to find Ben and make him pay. Meanwhile, Pete checked in with his sister Annie. He assured her they were climbing as fast as they could, but Annie spoke in a trembling voice, warning that they might not survive long enough for help to reach them. She begged Pete to turn back and save himself. But Pete refused to abandon her. No matter how impossible the situation seemed, he was determined to bring his sister home alive. Higher up the mountain, the situation had already turned deadly. Tom, who had been barely hanging on, was now in critical condition. While Annie had been asleep, Ben had quietly crept into their shelter and wrapped his hands around Tom's throat. Ben's motive was brutally simple: if Tom died, there would be one less person to share the remaining survival injections with, giving Ben more time to stay alive in the freezing conditions. After choking Tom to death, Ben rummaged through their supplies, stole every last vial of medicine, and slipped away into the storm without a trace. When Annie woke up, she immediately sensed something was wrong. Tom lay still beside her, his neck marked with deep bruises, undeniable signs of strangulation. And when she checked their supply kit, the injections were gone. In that instant, Annie realized the horrifying truth. Ben had murdered Tom, stolen the medicine, and abandoned her to die. Overwhelmed by fury and heartbreak, Annie finally snapped and attacked Ben with every ounce of strength left in her frozen, exhausted body. She pummeled him again and again, her screams echoing against the icy walls. In her mind, she kept seeing Tom's lifeless face, the bruises around his neck, the stolen medicine, proof of how far Ben was willing to go to save himself. The sheer selfishness made her rage boil over. Ben tried to fight back, but Annie's fury was unstoppable. Their violent struggle sent vibrations through the fragile ice chamber, and soon chunks of snow and ice began crashing down around them. The cave shook violently, forcing them to stumble apart. But the chaos revealed something miraculous: a narrow crack in the ice expanding into a small exit path. It was the first sign of escape they had seen in hours. Ben, calculating as ever, instantly understood the importance of leaving a mark. Rescue teams would only find him if he created a visible signal. Acting with cold precision, he knelt beside Tom's body, dipped his fingers into the pooled blood, and smeared a long streak of red up the icy wall. Then he climbed toward the surface and detonated a small explosive, splattering Tom's blood across the pale snow like a violent beacon. Miles away, Pete and two fellow climbers were racing across a neighboring ridge, braving deadly winds and sheer drops. They made a risky leap onto the next mountain face and finally reached the exact spot where the bloody signal stained the snow. Pete immediately understood: someone was alive beneath the ice. Without hesitation, he pulled out a compact explosive charge and set it off, blasting through the frozen wall. As the smoke cleared, he peered down into the newly opened crevice and his heart nearly stopped. There, far below, was his sister Annie, collapsed against the ice, barely moving. Adrenaline took over. Pete scrambled down the slope, slipping and clawing his way toward her. Annie's face was pale blue, her breath shallow, her eyelids fluttering as if she were drifting in and out of consciousness. Her body trembled violently from the cold, and she looked moments away from giving up entirely. Pete wrapped his arms around her, whispering that he was there now, that she wasn't going to die. He secured a rope around her waist and began hauling her upward inch by inch, fighting gravity, fatigue, and time itself. But the rope was old, frayed, and dangerously close to snapping under the strain. Every pull made the fibers stretch and crack. Just when Pete thought he might lose her, a shadow appeared behind him: Mike. Without saying a word, Mike grabbed the rope and pulled with brutal determination. His strength nearly doubled their progress. But Mike's jaw was clenched, his eyes burning with a mixture of grief, rage, and dark resolve. He was helping Annie, but he had no intention of saving Ben. Mike had found his wife frozen in the ice. He had discovered the empty medicine vials. And he knew the truth. Ben was the reason she had died. And now Mike was determined that Ben would not leave this mountain alive. Mike climbed straight down toward Ben with a terrifying determination, and the moment Ben saw him approaching, he panicked and launched a desperate attack. Ben had always been secretly afraid of Mike. He knew Mike was stronger, more experienced, and now fueled by the kind of rage only a grieving husband could carry. After all, Ben was the real reason Mike's wife had died during the avalanche. The guilt and fear twisted inside Ben as he swung wildly, trying to keep Mike away. The two men clashed violently, punching, kicking, and grappling with raw survival instinct as the icy cliff echoed with the sounds of their struggle. At one point, Mike gained the upper hand and had a perfect chance to kill Ben right there. But instead of delivering the fatal blow, Mike made a calculated choice. He hooked Ben's harness to his own safety line so Ben couldn't escape. If Ben was going to die, Mike would make sure it happened on his terms, not through a quick fall. Meanwhile, Pete and his teammates were desperately trying to pull Annie higher up the slope, their hands burning from the cold as they tugged the rope. But suddenly, a deep cracking sound echoed through the mountain. The ice beneath Mike and Ben gave way, collapsing into a massive crevice. Both men plunged downward, but the rope caught them, leaving them dangling helplessly in midair. Now all of them, Mike, Ben, and Annie, were hanging from the same single rope. Above them, only one climber, one of Pete's teammates, was holding the entire weight alone. The situation turned deadly instantly. The rope groaned and stretched to its limit, threatening to snap at any second. If it broke, everyone tied into the line would fall to their deaths. Time seemed to freeze as the climber above struggled to keep her grip. The cold wind howled around them, shaking the rope and adding even more strain. At that critical moment, Mike realized there was only one way to save the others. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a knife, and slowly moved his hand toward the rope. Pete immediately understood what Mike was about to do. The moment he saw Mike's hand reaching for the rope, he shouted for him to stop, his voice cracking with panic. Below them, Ben screamed in terror, begging Mike not to cut the line. He knew that if the rope was severed, both of them would fall straight into the depths of the icy cavern and die instantly. But Mike didn't hesitate for even a second. His face was set with cold determination and grief. Without looking back, he slashed the rope. In an instant, the line snapped, and both Mike and Ben vanished into the dark, echoing hollows of the mountain below. Their screams faded into silence as they disappeared into the depths. Some time later, it was revealed that Pete, his sister Annie, and one of their friends managed to survive and safely descend the mountain. The rescue team quickly reached them and began emergency treatment. Annie was still in terrible condition, weak and frostbitten, but the doctors assured Pete that she would recover. When Annie finally opened her eyes, brother and sister looked at each other with overwhelming relief and gratitude. After everything they had endured, the fear, the loss, the impossible struggle, their bond felt stronger and purer than ever. And with that, our story comes to an end.